During the First World War, the United States kind of leaps onto the world stage. And what it kind of discovers is that the world is sort of a dangerous place. Remember that we go to war in 1917, yeah, with some fairly idealistic and lofty goals. Wilson promises that this will be a war in which the world will be made safe for democracy. And the way he intends to make the world safe for democracy is by kind of reorganizing the entire international system and by creating a League of Nations that will fairly and impartially arbitrate disputes between nations that are in conflict with one another. But remember that after getting almost the entire rest of the world on board with that idea, Congress says no. And to be honest, you can't just entirely blame this issue on Henry Cabot Lodge. The fact is that many Americans weren't entirely convinced that the United States should participate in the League of Nations, and you can kind of think of the League of Nations as a symbol of this very new and strange role that the United States has adopted, where we've gone from, George Washington's farewell address, where, remember, Cliff Notes version is George Washington's like, by the way, guys, no political parties and stay out of Europe, in which now, after the Treaty of Versailles, it looks like the United States, not only is it, meddling in European affairs, it's defining them. The 14 points, remember, serve as the basis for the Treaty of Versailles itself. If that's not meddling or intervening, I'm not sure what is. But again, Americans say no. And of course, as the 1920s and the 1930s roll on, not only does it seem like the world isn't really any safer for democracy, it actually looks like democracy is in more danger than it's ever been in human history. So Americans kind of feel this sense of ambivalence, this question of, well, what has this all really been for? And one slogan that we use to define the era of the 1920s is a return to normalcy. And spoiler, the next lecture you'll hear about how Warren G. Harding uses that slogan to coast to a fairly decisive victory in 1920, where he's elected president. But like I say in that lecture, if you have to be that person who talks about getting back to normal, that can we just get back to the way things were, the very fact that you have to mention it suggests that things are never getting back to normal. And things are not just, not only can things not go back to normal because of what's transpired during the First World War, but also what's also happened is that the country has really dramatically changed during the last 30 to 40 years. And so we're going to talk about some things caused by the impact of the First World War and some other things that we've already discussed. So the 1920s in American history, it marks kind of this watershed moment where for the first time in the history of the United States, we become an urban nation. Remember that Thomas Jefferson sort of conceptualized Americans as a republic of small, independent, well-educated farmers. Well, the fact is that we're not really farming anymore. Not only are we not living in cities, not living in the countryside, we're living in cities. We're working in factories. And so what you kind of see is that there's a really strong reaction to this. And this urban versus rural divide becomes one of the core areas of friction in American society. And this is kind of reflected in art to a certain extent, where you see, of course, American art has always been about the landscape. But if you look at sort of the major art, sort of artistic accomplishments, at least in portraiture during this time period, you see that there's this kind of nostalgia for the countryside. You have Edward Hopper's The Lighthouse at Two Lights. And then, probably other than Whistler's Mother, the most famous painting in American history, American Gothic. Now, American Gothic was painted by Grant Wood, and it's supposed to depict a family in Iowa. Funny thing here is that the people that Wood used as his model farmers, one, this guy is not actually an Iowan farmer. This is actually Hopper's dentist, and apparently Hopper just, sorry, Wood, not Hopper. Wood just thought that his dentist just looked the part of a farmer. And this is not actually supposed to be the farmer's wife. This is actually supposed to be the guy's daughter. But that being said, people weren't really sure if this was supposed to satirize rural people and their conventions and mannerisms and all that, or if this was supposed to kind of portray a sort of resiliency. And people sort of argue about that today, actually. But again, you do see this return to the countryside, and of course we saw that during the Industrial Revolution, where romantic art sort of glamorized the natural and the landscape, precisely because you're seeing less of that, because thank you very much factories. But even here's another portrait by Edward Hopper. This is probably one of my favorite portraits of all time. And you could probably talk endlessly about this. And this is a painting called The Nighthawks. Now, whenever we are talking about art, we always have to be careful to not be too dogmatic in what a particular piece of art actually means. Because one, it's really not about determining the meaning, it's about the discussion and the analysis. And art is subjective, it's symbolic, and so therefore reasonable people can agree to disagree. So, in other words, what I'm about to tell you right now, take with several large grains of salt, if not an entire salt shaker's worth of salt. And for many of you, you're like, okay, Mr. Dry's telling us to skip. No, not exactly. This is supposed to depict a Waffle House style diner set in the city. And this was obviously painted in 1942. So it kind of goes a little bit beyond the period that we're talking about. But remember that when you're dealing with culture and art and these broader movements, dates become less important to a certain extent, because they're not events. They're developments that, to a certain extent, transcend events. The fact that Americans are now living disproportionately in the city now, that's not an event as much as it's been this long historic process that really started during the days of industrialization. So a couple of things we can kind of see here is that notice how bright the interior is, and but at the same time, the figures involved are kind of distant. You can't really clearly see their faces. One person has their back turned to the artist. I was about to say the camera, but no, the artist. And also notice just how dark and kind of gloomy and deserted the streets are. Now, maybe if you were to go back in time and ask Edward Hopper, like, what this painting was supposed to be, and he would say, well, I wanted to paint a scene of a diner at night. And sometimes art is like that. One great example of this playing out literally is apparently Robert Mitchum was considered one of the great actors of the 1950s and 1960s. Like the nuance of his performances, was just spot on. He was emotional. He was able to kind of channel inspiration. And a lot of critics just gushed over Robert Mitchum. And I remember there was one review by a critic by the name of Roger Ebert, who was just saying that, Mitchum's performance in this movie, whatever that was multi-layered and very complicated, and Mitchum had sort of considered X, Y, and Z. And then when Mitchum heard about that review, he said the following: well, I don't really know what he's talking about. I have two ways of acting, one on the horse and one off the horse, because he was kind of a great sort of Western cowboy actor. So sometimes art can be subconscious. Or if you're less charitable, you can also say that this is just all BS and nonsense. And I kind of understand that perspective too. But the fact is that we're influenced by our environments. And one of the things we do know is that living in cities. It creates economic opportunities. Life is very complicated and very chaotic, but also kind of fun in a certain way. But also, there's that sense of isolation that comes from being separated from your family. And so that sense of loneliness. And we talked about that during the progressive era as well, that you have a lot of organizations like the YMCA that kind of emerge in response to this pattern of urbanization. And you can definitely see that. And again, you could also argue that this sort of this artistic style, or at least the themes present in the Nighthawks, is not all that distant from some of the themes brought up in the Ashcan School. Albeit, I think this is a little bit more abstract. But remember, the Ashcan School is a school of that sort of combines impressionist brushstrokes in a way that's supposed to sort of depict a very frank image of city life. And so you're kind of seeing this these mixed feelings as the country becomes more and more urban. Not only are images of where Americans live beginning to change, but Americans themselves, their self-image is starting to change. Specifically, if you're looking at women. Now, I know that some of you are going, well, of course, because now with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, women can now vote. And that's kind of a historical change. But also there's some other shifts that are going on. The thing is that World War I is a total war. And like almost all big wars throughout American history, and I would also argue throughout human history, total wars kind of make traditional gender roles a little inconvenient. And so women start working outside the house a little bit more. And just because the war is now over doesn't mean that society can kind of turn on a dime and go back to the way things were. So the war itself doesn't exactly destroy Germany's ability to make war. I'm sure you guys already know this. But it does destroy certain Victorian attitudes towards women. And remember that Victorianism is, this term that we use to describe, a series of kind of interrelated beliefs. It also sort of connects to art, architecture, to a certain extent. And basically, it's used to describe mostly middle-class, very moralistic and traditional views on morality, gender roles, society, so on. So in the Victorian mindset, and it's important to remember that Victorianism isn't just in the UK, it's also in the United States during the 19th century. The Victorian mindset is that sexuality was an unfortunate means to an end. That it was the means by which the species kind of, refrained from going extinct. But it wasn't supposed to be something that was celebrated by any stretch of the imagination. And particularly if you're looking at women, because remember that Victorianism is really connected to this whole idea of the cult of domesticity, that women are supposed to be mothers. And suddenly if you're starting to talk about women as having certain types of sexual autonomy, what that kind of means is that, at least to the mindset of the time, that kind of undermined their role as being mothers and caretakers first. But again, World War I causes some of those attitudes to change, but also other developments do. So the thing is that the dating scene begins to change dramatically. So if you're looking at relationships between men and women during the 19th century, the way they dated is, first off, they didn't date, they courted. And what courtship involved is that if you wanted to, if you were interested in being a suitor, you would call upon by the way, I'm talking about males because females were not supposed to do this, but males would call upon an eligible female that they were interested in, and provided that the female's family approved, they would get together and hang out in the parlor of the house. um, along with the entire rest of the family. Because, of course, you've got to chaperone these individuals. But the thing is that now we have the development of the automobile, where middle class people suddenly have the ability to go other places that are not one another's house, and not really so much court, but date. And the thing is that this also does lead to an increase in premarital sexual activity. And of course, we know that that's not exactly a new development, but the scale of this increases. Legitimacy rates start to decline during the 1920s, and this also causes some significant pushback because one of the confusing things about the 1920s is that the 1920s, or at least if you're looking at the world sort of represented in novels, especially of the 1920s, is that the 1920s is all about the big cities. It's all about prohibition. It's all about flappers. It's all about this kind of live, eat, and be merry kind of lifestyle, this Epicurean and hedonism. But if you actually go to the countryside, there's like this equal and opposite pushback that people who are more traditionally minded look at these developments with horror. And of course, not just people in the countryside, but people in cities as well. But we don't really hear as much about that side of the 1920s, but it exists, and that actually becomes very, very important in just a second. So let's see how the new woman is different from the Victorian.
What were they? There was a woman crossing the road and holding her dress up and showing her ankle to there.
Tut. Florence.
Of course, by the 1920s, we're showing a lot more than ankles.
In the music jazz, the dance, the Charleston.
So if you're thinking about the cult of domesticity, think of the new woman as a gauntlet thrown down. Because the new woman cut her hair short as opposed to the longer hair that was associated with being more maternal. She wore shorter, more form-fitting dresses as opposed to, this, and also freely used makeup, would drink at speakeasies, even though they were kind of sort of, prohibited under the, the Prohibition Amendment. And also she had a little bit more autonomy in who she dated. So again, are we looking at this quantum leap forward for women? Not necessarily from today's standards, but if you think about the Victorian world and how far women have come in a very short time period, it actually is a fairly dramatic leap. Black Americans experiences changes that are profound yet more subtle. We're still a long way from Brown versus Board of Education or the Civil Rights or Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. So the question is, what do African Americans really get out of the First World War? And if you're looking at it on paper, the answer is not much. You're not going to see like a 13th or 14th or 15th Amendment or again, like any of the Civil Rights Acts. You're not going to see that kind of, watershed piece of legislation that ends historic injustice here. Whether that historic injustice is Jim Crow or black codes or slavery, which, by the way, tells you just how many we're talking about here. But what you do see are really dramatic consequences because of the First World War. More specifically, the Harlem Renaissance. So most of you, I think, have already heard of the Harlem Renaissance. But the Harlem Renaissance itself was to a certain extent influenced by the Great Migration. The fact that millions of African Americans are leaving the South in historically large numbers. They're moving to northern states mostly to sort of fill in gaps left in the workforce by the First World War. And so you have this increase in the number of African Americans in big cities like New York. And that intermixing of, culture, that produces the Harlem Renaissance. And so some of the figures that we kind of associate with the Harlem Renaissance, we've already talked about. One of them, you can kind of, he's less sort of associated with the literary and artistic part of it, but it's W.E.B. Du Bois. Like, we kind of think of him as being more politically oriented, which he was, but remember that W.E.B. Du Bois is kind of like this image of, or the symbol of, who African Americans could aspire to be. Du Bois was incredibly well educated, was the first African American to obtain a doctoral degree from Harvard, but he's not the only person of note here, because the preeminent figures, or the preeminent figure, it has to be mentioned, is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is actually not an African American. He's not a first. He is Jamaican born and immigrates with his family during the 19 teens, actually during the First World War. And remember that Jamaica was a former slave colony, but had obtained independence, or not independence, but had basically chattel slavery had ended in Jamaica during the early 19th century. And so what happens is that, when people like Marcus Garvey, or with Marcus Garvey, immigrate to the United States, they find that they are treated very differently than they are in their home country, where they're treated as second-class citizens. And Marcus Garvey becomes a very eloquent proponent of what we can kind of call Black nationalism. Black nationalism is this idea that African Americans should sort of separate and form their own society, apart from, the federal government. Now, what's interesting here, it's interesting for a few reasons. One, it's interesting because there are some connections with what Garvey believes with the past, as well as in other things we're going to talk about. Because Garvey believes in almost like a Wilsonian self-determination for Black people, and that Black people should organize themselves into a nation state based upon race. And this means that he kind of resurrects the whole idea of, if you guys remember, the efforts to colonize parts of West Africa, freeing slaves during the 1820s and 30s and transporting them to West Africa. Garvey kind of champions that idea and emphasizes and pushes for the resettling of Black Americans to Africa, which also means that Garvey is what you would call a Pan-Africanist. This is somebody who believes that basically the nation states of Africa are united by a shared racial identity, and they should unify on that basis. But the other thing here is that some of Garvey's ideas in terms of like racially separating people, that those kind of sound a little familiar, and they should, at least, because it's very similar logic to the logic of Jim Crow, creating states or societies based upon race. Some of the racially based logic that Garvey uses is, in fact, very similar to Jim Crow, but we also have to explain some pretty significant differences. Remember that Jim Crow laws are put into place to sort of cement or defend a system of hierarchy and white supremacy. It's about preserving a social pyramid, more or less. Whereas for Garvey, it's simply about protection. That he points out that it doesn't. It seems like black people in the United States are treated very differently than white people, and you can obviously see that reflected in the laws of certain states and even in the practices of the federal government. And so, so far, if you look at the campaign of lynchings that have, gone unpunished in the Deep South, like, how are you going to protect people from that? And in Garvey's view, the only solution is by just giving up on this whole idea of a multiracial society where citizenship is awarded at birth and just to go somewhere else. And we should also point out that some of Garvey's ideas were very influential with some of the leading figures of the civil rights era, most notably Malcolm X, who looks at Garvey as kind of like his role model during the early part of his life. Now, I know you're probably like, oh, Mr. Dry, there you go talking about politics and political history again. Well, the thing is that life is political, by the way, and especially life for African Americans during this time period and beyond. But, the fact is that the Harlem Renaissance is kind of associated with this flowering of black culture. And one of the reasons for this is that, remember, this is kind of like an anthropology point, but culture really starts and develops in the cities. There's a reason why you call it the golden age of Athens as opposed to the golden age of the suburbs of Athens or, the Athenian farms. It's thought that, because you're getting people of all different social classes and all different backgrounds in cities, that this fusion kind of allows for the creation of culture. And so because of the Great Migration, you now have, significantly large numbers of African Americans in cities. And so the real developments that we can kind of point to is, one, the popularization and further development of jazz music and its incorporation with, in many cases, literary styles and poetry. Langston Hughes, for example, is a poet who, really kind of comes almost after this time period a little bit, but during the, Langston Hughes is almost kind of one of the symbols of the Harlem Renaissance. And of course, his most famous work comes from a montage on a dream deferred, which contains the 12 or 11 lines that we know as the dream deferred.
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
Now, profound thought of the day, poetry is super subjective, and there's a lot of debate as to what a dream deferred actually means. Some scholars speculate that Langston Hughes was talking about Harlem, that Harlem itself is the dream, and that some of the events that he discusses in the poem are actually allusions to events that happened to Harlem in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. What I'd like you guys to do is to maybe do a little bit of research on this, not too much, but I want you to be able to write a short paragraph on what you think Langston Hughes is talking about, and I want you to add that paragraph to your portfolio. I know this isn't an English class, and I know that we don't usually sort of dive into poetry, but this is the exception. So to Miss Udi and Miss Peterson, you're welcome. The other development that we associate with the Harlem Renaissance is the maturation of jazz music. And we've sort of talked about this during the progressive era, right? That jazz music sort of grows organically out of other musical styles that were sort of popular around the Mississippi Delta area. And of course, they spread into the North because of the Great Migration. So jazz music is unique in U.S. history for a variety of reasons. And not to be tautological here, but The big reason is that it's unique. It is a uniquely American form of music, and it springs up within the black community. The other thing, though, is that the popularization of jazz allows African American musicians to sort of cross over into mainstream popularity. You have examples like Louis Armstrong, and he's probably the most well-known musician who sort of crosses over and develops an audience among white people as well as black people. But he's not the only example. And that being said, though, we also have to remember that it wasn't exactly uncommon to see black musicians playing the piano or playing various other musical instruments in bars and taverns and speakeasies, even during Prohibition. So the question is, like, why is the 1920s so game changing? And it all comes down to this: the development of radio. Now, radio technology is actually nothing new during the 1920s. An Italian physicist by the name of Guglielmo Marconi develops radio communication as early as the year 1900. So it's been about 20 years, but in the year 1920 in the United States, we see the first commercial radio station established in Pittsburgh, the radio station KDKA. So you've got one commercial radio station in the year 1920. And by the year 1922, you see 600 radio stations. So, I mean, I don't know, like, what percentage increase you're really looking at there over 2 years, but it's a significant one. And the thing is that kind of like the newspapers, the things that you would find in radio broadcasts would be anything and everything. Just like newspapers would print, basically anything that you could conceive of. So too would radio stations broadcast anything that people would find interesting. In fact, this is, in some respects, the most interesting time period for radio as a medium, because nowadays radio is kind of sad and pathetic. Maybe not as sad and pathetic as newspapers, but the fact is that radio has kind of lost its niche. But back in the day, radio would, not only would they broadcast sporting events and debates and news, like the stuff that most people find boring, and by the way, music, this was also kind of the heyday for radio dramas, because we're still a ways away from television. The motion picture industry is still in its infancy, and so the kind of like the great dramatic medium of the day was radio. So, nowadays it's really rare to find companies that produce radio dramas. And as somebody who loves voice acting, this is a fascinating time period for me, because this is a time period in which stories were told just through the power of voice. And probably the most famous example of this, though, is the following.
I'll move the microphone nearer. Here. Now, we're not more than 25 feet away. Can you hear it now? Professor Pearson?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us the meaning of that scraping noise inside the thing?
Possibly the unequal cooling of its surface.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
What do you think? The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth, and you can see its cylindrical
Just a minute.
shape.
Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and the thing must be hollow.
He's moving. Look at that. He's back there. He's back there. Keep those men back. He's back there. Keep those idiots back. He's off. The top blew. Look out there. Stand back.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone crawling out or something. I can see turning out of that black hole two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost the heavens. Something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one and another one and another one. They look like tentacles to me. Oh, yeah, I can see the thing's body now. It's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face, ladies and gentlemen, can describe it. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. Its eyes are black, and they gleam like a serpent in the mouth. There's a kind of V-shape with saliva dripping from its rimless lips that seem to quiver and pulsate, and the monster, or whatever it is, can hardly move. It seems weighed down by possibly gravity or something. The thing's rising up now, and the crowd falls back. There seems plenty. The most extraordinary experience, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find words. Well,
What this kind of demonstrates is that yellow journalism has got nothing on radio because the War of the Worlds broadcast it actually convinces Americans, or at least many Americans, that an alien invasion is actually taking place. And for young aspiring actor Orson Welles, that's kind of a nice little feather in your cap that you convince otherwise rational people, or kind of rational people, that an alien invasion has taken place. But at the same time, maybe this is evidence that Americans are just as impressionable then as they are now. Who knows? But you could also maybe use this as evidence, tangential evidence, but evidence nonetheless, that supports our original thesis that in this quest for a return to normalcy, that very quest suggests that you're never going to go back to the way things were, at least not completely. Because if things are so destabilized, and if things have changed so much that Americans are, receptive or open to the idea that an alien invasion has actually taken place, what does that say about the changes that have taken place during the last 20 or 30 years? Who knows? It's kind of a rhetorical question, but it's something for us to ponder. So the War of the Worlds, you can kind of argue, is an example of just how innovative radio could actually be. And this is radio's golden age, the time period where it's at its most innovative as a medium. But at the same time, you also see some continuations. That go all the way back to the 19th century and maybe even earlier than that. Because we've talked a lot about how the legacy of slavery and white supremacy has affected entertainment and really just American history and culture in general. But you might remember us talking about the emergence of the minstrel shows and how minstrel shows would very often involve white actors who would don black face paint and depict stock characters like Jim Crow. And of course, Jim Crow, the stock character, later has his name taken to and used to describe laws that basically segregate or exclude black Americans from white Americans, among other things, right? Excuse me. So those minstrel shows were extremely popular. Now, you kind of see a reemergence of that. In radio programs. Actually, one of the most popular radio programs in the United States during this time period was the Amos and Andy show, in which, again, white broadcasters would basically depict black stereotypes or try to mimic stereotypical behavior in a way to kind of demean black people. And again, this radio program was exceedingly popular. The legacy of Jim Crow and the minstrel shows also seeped into another innovative medium that was coming into its own during the 1920s, and that is, of course, film. We talked about how film during the early 20th century, the 1900s, 19 teens, was still fairly undeveloped, and that a film was not like this 2 to 3 hour long monstrosity, but instead was sometimes just 2 to 3 minutes long. Most likely somewhere in the range between 5 to 10 minutes, but until D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, films were supposed to be, and usually were, very short. But we had Birth of a Nation, which demonstrated just how long and how epic in scope films could be. But again, remember that Birth of a Nation also unapologetically glamorized the Ku Klux Klan. Remember that in just a minute. but also the legacy of Jim Crow sort of lived even beyond Birth of a Nation. So if you look at film, even after Birth of a Nation, it's still almost unrecognizable today because, again, the technology hadn't been developed to incorporate sound into the film. So if you wanted music for your films, you actually had to, hire an orchestra that would play music to accompany your film. Dialogue was basically exchanged with a sort of a text placard that would sort of intersperse scenes in a movie. And of course, that kind of slows things down just a little bit. So that all changes with the release of a movie in 1927 called The Jazz Singer, in which the protagonist, the jazz singer, is a white actor in blackface. So once again, we have an example of an incredibly innovative, groundbreaking film in American cinematic history that is also a resurrection of racist stereotypes. So let's transition from the depressing to the absurd. This is the part where Mr. Dry gets to pretend to be an English teacher. The result's not going to be pretty. But I did say that it's going to be absurd. And to be honest, that is kind of what modernism, literary modernism, is all about. Remember that we talked about the emergence of realism in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and this is kind of a response to the more idealistic portrayals of the world in sort of like through romantic art, romantic literature, and realism is kind of a response to that. It tries to depict people and events as they sort of actually happen, without all the fancy stuff. You can find a more academic definition, but that's probably a pretty good description. Now what we're seeing, though, is we're seeing a shift away from realism to modernism. And basically, if there's a theme there, it's, realism is about trying to capture the truth, the reality of existence. Modernism basically is an artistic and literary and philosophical school of thought that says that you really can't be sure what reality is. And I think there's a couple of different developments to speak to that. One is that if you're trying to find something absurd, well, what could be more absurd than the First World War itself? During the First World War, millions of people die because of an Austrian archduke. Of course, it's not as simple as that, but isn't it to a certain extent? So you've got that. Also, it seems like the world is just rapidly changing because of changes in norms, changes in what women are doing, changes in the cities, changes in how people are getting from place to place. Now we're driving on roads and flying in aircraft. And also, just to kind of show how trippy things have gotten, you also have changes in how people view the universe itself. In the early 20th century, physics was dead. You would probably want to discourage anybody you really cared about from becoming a physicist because based upon a popular consensus at the time, and even consensus among physicists, it was thought that all the great mysteries of physics had been solved, mostly by Sir Isaac Newton, by the way, all the way back in the late 16 and early 1700s. And remember, and we actually talked a lot about Newton's sort of vision of the universe when we were discussing the roots of the Great Awakening. And remember, Newton's universe was a cold universe. It was an orderly universe. It was a tiny one that operated under very predictable physical laws. That if you knew the mass of an object and you knew what forces acted upon it, you could kind of predict its trajectory, where it would move through the universe. But then there's that patent clerk from Germany named Albert Einstein, and he came along and basically demonstrated with an absurd amount of math that actually not only are some of those assumptions incorrect, but actually there's a whole lot more about the universe that we just weren't aware of. So, for example, and this boggles my mind, but Einstein proved with math that gravity kind of changes everything. And that if, for example, you have an object with a sufficiently dense mass, like, for example, the core of a dead star, a neutron star, then eventually it might actually collapse in on itself, basically implode under the weight of its own mass. And when that happens, apparently, at a point in space, the object's mass increases to infinity. And when that happens, it creates a void in space time that not even light can escape from. And of course, we call that a black hole. And Newton never considered the possibility of a black hole. I mean, who would? The whole idea that gravity can be so strong up to a point that light can get sucked into it, that sounds like, a horror story written by, H.P. Lovecraft. It doesn't sound like physics, but Einstein, before we actually had observable evidence of a black hole, predicted it with the math. And he also predicted, among other things, that time itself isn't constant. Time is relative. Hence, by the way, one explanation for the theory of relativity. So, for example, if you were riding on a beam of light, time for you would stand still, but time for everybody else would proceed normally. And that gravity itself can actually influence the flow of time. So what this kind of did to a certain extent is it's almost like discovering that, everything is a lie to a certain extent, or that that's not true, that everything is mostly correct, except for like the identity of a certain special ingredient. And that's what Einstein brings to the table. And we're still kind of making more and more discoveries and deductions based upon Einstein's theory of general and special relativity. And you're probably like, Mr. Dry, this is about books. You said you were going to become an English teacher, and now you're doing physics, and not a very good job. I will agree to that. But the reason why I sort of emphasize this is that this is maybe one of the sources of modernism, that the clockwork universe that Newton developed back in the 16 and 1700s, the clockwork cosmological model, if you will, like, that's not right. Things aren't as predictable or aren't as simple as you would think. There are some things that are hard to calculate. And so even science itself starts to become maybe not unpredictable, but at the very least it becomes a lot more mysterious. And you can kind of pick up on some of those things, this ambivalence and distrust in conceptions of reality in modernism. So among other things, I'm not going to necessarily spend a huge amount of time on all of these works, but I'll kind of give you sort of an idea of what this actually, how some of these books sort of connect to some of those themes. So, for example, when you're looking at William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. The Sound and the Fury uses a number of different narratives in the book, and some of them contradict each other, by the way. The reader is kind of left wondering what's true and what's not. Also, by the way, you get a sense of ambivalence in the writing of Ernest Hemingway about the First World War as a whole. And what it accomplished. A Farewell to Arms is a very tragic story about an American ambulance driver who serves with the Italian army before America actually enters the war. And you get themes of anti-militarism and kind of deep ambivalence about the author, the protagonist's role in the story. Now, also, probably, I'm going to do a terrible job with this, but I think at this point, most of you have probably read F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. But The Great Gatsby is, among other things, a meditation on the American dream and keeping up with the Joneses, if you will. Now, by the way, sophomores, I don't think you've probably read this yet, but basically, modernism is about questioning the reality of any and everything. Maybe you could reduce this ambivalence to, the cosmological model of the universe changing. Oh, I'm sure that's it. Americans are deeply affected by the fact that physics has changed. Or maybe it's, this is really unlikely. But maybe it's the fact that Americans are still getting rip-roaringly drunk, despite the fact that we now have the 18th Amendment. One of the things that I think every teacher learns is that if you tell people not to do something, that works probably for the people who weren't going to do that thing anyway, but for a different set of the population, it just kind of encourages them to do that thing. And prohibition kind of works like that. But the other thing is, of course, that there are financial incentives for consumption of alcohol to continue apace. And so what we kind of see is that despite the fact that alcohol consumption is banned because of the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment, that becomes almost impossible to enforce. And you see this the growth in basically this black market in bootlegging. In which alcohol is sort of distilled and sold. And just to give you guys an idea of how significant bootlegging was in the 1920s, Detroit, which is all about industry, apparently Detroit's second largest industry in the 1920s after cars was the production of alcohol. And Detroit, by the way, was the most industrialized city on the planet. And that just gives you an idea of how significant alcohol consumption was, despite the fact that you have a prohibition. So we see the emergence of the speakeasy culture, in which you have sort of bars or private gatherings in which you had to speak the password in order to gain entry. And of course, when we're talking about changes in social norms, especially for women, at many, not all, but at many of these speakeasies, women were allowed to enter and participate too, which again, if you're looking at the old cult of domesticity, women drinking recreationally with members of the opposite sex that they weren't married to, like that doesn't really conform to, stereotypical motherly behavior. So the speakeasy culture is also kind of tied to the emergence of the new woman during the 1920s. But along with the emergence of speakeasies, you also have the emergence of organized crime. And this connects to a variety of different things, by the way. I mean, Prohibition does give us this, NASCAR, which originally emerges because, of course, when you're trying to transport alcohol, the question is, what if the authorities find out? And so you need fast getaway drivers to transport alcohol from point A to point B. But eventually that sort of becomes a competitive sport as different sort of drivers are trying to demonstrate their getaway driving skills. And so, of course, NASCAR certainly outlasts Prohibition. And that's maybe a more genteel or example of, the development of organized crime during the Gilded Age. By the way, I'm not saying that NASCAR is by any stretch of the imagination a criminal organization, at least as far as I know. Prove me wrong. But probably the most famous example of, real organized crime during Prohibition is this guy. To the extent that people think about Al Capone at all, they probably think of him as that guy in a suit with a cigar clenched between his teeth, with, of course, the Tommy gun, right? Who talks like this, say. The reality, though, is that Al Capone, the real Al Capone, is very different than the Al Capone in fiction. Al Capone cut a very striking figure in his day, but the historical Al Capone, when you really sort of strip away sort of the romance or the sensationalism about what he did, is that you almost kind of have like I don't want to say like a business leader, but that's really what he was. He was a leader of a Chicago gang that cornered the market on the distribution of alcohol, and of course he made money doing other things. He was involved in prostitution and gambling and racketeering, but really where he made most of his money was in the sale of alcohol during Prohibition. And of course, he does sort of develop his fame during an event called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which approximately 7 other members of a rival gang are machine gunned down. But realistically, Al Capone is somebody, before this, who sort of capitalizes on the demand for alcohol during this time period. Also, the fact that Al Capone himself was the son of immigrants was also kind of interesting, because after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Al Capone becomes is dubbed by local newspapers public enemy number one in Chicago. And it's kind of easy to see why that would be the case, but we also have to remember, and we'll talk more about this going on, that this is a time period where America is in the midst of almost like this anti-immigrant hysteria. And so we have to also take that into account when talking about Al Capone and organized crime during this time period. So speaking of discrimination against immigrants, let's talk about nativism, which emerges during this time period, as well as suppression of suspected communist groups. Believe it or not, the two things are linked, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, and that might be confusing, so be prepared to ask questions in class if you have any. So during the First World War, remember, we sort of open up Pandora's box and allow nativism to kind of get out as a way of promoting patriotism during the First World War. The thing is that once you open Pandora's box, that box stays open. And that drive to make everything 100% American continues even after the war is over. The other thing that happens is that war itself is destabilizing. And a lot of Europe is devastated because of the war. The question is, like, if you don't like living in a cratered shell hole, where can you go? And for many people, especially people in Eastern and Southern Europe, the United States was a place to go to escape the political and social upheavals that they were experiencing in their own countries. Remember that Eastern Europe is basically redrawn during the Treaty of Versailles. You have the creation, or in many cases, resurrections of countries that did not exist before the First World War. And that creates a very unstable environment, and many people in those areas decide to immigrate to the United States. The question is, why are they immigrating? And many Americans believed that you have people who are immigrating to the United States not just to kind of find a better life, but to spread certain political beliefs, especially communist beliefs. Because remember, this is during a time period after the emergence of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is committed, at least on paper, to basically spreading the communist revolution through any means possible. And so we'll also talk about how there's some degree of truth to that. And the Soviet Union does try to spread communism. It just wasn't as successful as a lot of people thought that it would be. But still, there's this thought that many Americans have, that the immigrants that are fleeing from Eastern and Southern Europe are socialist and or communist and or anarchist dissidents. Those fears of communism and immigrants also start to connect to racial fears and panics. So what happens, like we've talked about, is that in 1919, there are a series of protests where African Americans who are returning home are kind of demanding better treatment. And some of these groups are led by black communists. And so what happens is that the fallacy of hasty generalization rears its ugly head. And the fallacy of hasty generalization is the fallacy of assuming that because some people in a group conform to this trait, in this case, the trait being communism, therefore all people in this group must be blank. again, in this case, communist. So when you have local militia groups or National Guard units, or in some cases, white supremacist organizations that go out in force and suppress many of these protests, at least their defense is that they weren't suppressing race riots so much as they were suppressing, communist insurgents. That's why it's called the Red Summer. And so what happens is that, bizarrely enough, you have the linkage of, racial discrimination with discrimination against immigrants, with also this, these lingering fears of communist infiltration. Some of these fears are demonstrated in one of the landmark trials in the 1920s called the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. This is a trial that involved Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetta, who were on trial for armed robbery and murder. And it was suspected, at least at the time, that the reason that they were arrested and put on trial was more because they were anarchists and not really because of any real evidence that was obtained. And the fact is that the trial was highly irregular, where the judge, who was normally supposed to be an impartial arbiter in the trial, actually goes and basically, practically, testifies against them. Things that you don't have to have a law degree to know that, that should not, things that shouldn't happen in trial. But that being said, the thing is that we now know that they were probably guilty, but because of just some of the procedural violations, the fact that it seemed like people were bending over backwards and concluding they were guilty before actual evidence was shown, is kind of an example of just how far this anti-immigrant hysteria is kind of taken. So what do these attitudes lead to? Well, among other things, we'll get to these guys in just a second, the Palmer raids. The Palmer raids were raids in which federal law enforcement, under the direction of Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, would basically round up and deport hundreds of immigrants, really just for having leftist political views. Either they were suspected of being socialist or communist. And again, most of those arrests were without due process rights. In other words, you don't really have search warrants. They're just kind of rounded up without recognition of some basic sort of procedural rights. So we kind of associate this with this anti-immigration hysteria because, yeah, it's really about, fighting against the Bolsheviks, the communists, the Soviet Union. And we kind of associate this with what's called the Red Scare. There are two Red Scares in U.S. history. The first is during the 1920s, and the second one, by the way, is we associate with Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. But this one is less about the threats from the Soviet Union, really, and it's more about fears of immigration. And what's also kind of fascinating and yet terrifying at the same time is that these fears of immigrants, it causes a resurrection in the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, which had basically been stamped out during Reconstruction under Grant's supervision, it reemerges by the year 1915. And partially, by the way, there were other white supremacist groups in the United States, but remember that the Klan was compelling for a lot of people just because of the costumes and the mystery that surrounded them. And D.W. Griffith tapped into that when he made the film Birth of a Nation. And so this is, once again, an example of life imitating art, because due to the success of that film, the Klan is reconstituted, and it grows, well, let's just say that its growth is kind of terrifying. In a country that numbered only a little over 100 million people, there were approximately 3 to 8 million members of the KKK by 1915. And very often these were in places beyond the Deep South. It was estimated that in the state of Indiana, roughly 1/3 of the male population could be considered Klan members. And again, Indiana was kind of on the Union side of the Civil War. But that doesn't mean that you don't have, let's say, significant numbers of white supremacists in those areas. But the Ku Klux Klan, interestingly, it isn't just responding to events like the Red Summer. Because of course the Klan organizes before the Red Summer. They're also responding to a number of other developments that the emergence of communism, especially in the Soviet Union, and also Jewish immigration. Jewish immigration has sort of picked up in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th century. You can kind of say that they're anti-everything, but they're especially anti-black, anti-communist, anti-Jew, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-bootlegger. So in the 1920s, there's actually this march on Washington, D.C., in which over 50,000 Klansmen attend. You can kind of see this image right here. And so what happens is that, to a certain extent, the KKK during Reconstruction really was a white supremacist terrorist organization. They would go out and lynch people, intimidate black people and Republicans, especially in the South, from voting. This KKK is a little bit different. This KKK, believe it or not, is a little bit more mainstream. It doesn't necessarily, at least for people at the time, have that connotation as being this illegal terrorist organization. It almost, again, kind of goes a little mainstream. It starts to advocate for changes in immigration laws. And the Klan kind of declines a little bit after 1925, but it declines because, Washington listens to a certain extent, and restrictions on immigration are actually passed. So the first action is that you have what's called the Emergency Quota Act. And the Emergency Quota Act basically caps immigration to 2% of all nationals living in the United States in 1890. So what this does, I mean, if you think about immigration, you probably know that the number of English Americans or German American or even Irish Americans in the year 1890 probably eclipses the number of Italian Americans or Russian Americans who do around the same time period. So let's say that, and I'm just pulling numbers out of nowhere, but let's say that there are roughly 10 million Irish Americans living in the U.S. in the year 1890. That would mean that my math skills my math skills are highly suspect, but I believe that would mean that 200,000 people from Ireland could immigrate to the United States in a given year. Well, let's say that there are only 100,000 Russian Americans living in the U.S. in 1890. Well, that would mean that you could only bring in, about 4,000 people? But even these restrictions weren't enough for some people. So in 1924, you have the Immigration Act, sometimes called the Johnson and Reed Act, in which immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe is limited, and immigration from Asia is all but excluded. And actually, if you look at the numbers, it basically leads to an 80% decline in the number of immigrants before the act is actually passed. So again, we see policies that are put into place to not just reduce the number of immigrants, but reduce the number of immigrants that are coming in from non-Western European countries. So there's a considerable amount of fear that we kind of pick up on during the 1920s, fears about the future of the country. And once again, we're actually going to return briefly to that urban and rural divide. So the world of the 1920s that you're kind of familiar with is the kind of semi-hedonistic world depicted by F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, the world sort of portrayed by the speakeasies. But if you actually go beyond the cities, you have a very different view of life in the United States. So what we see in the 1920s is that you see the emergence of religious fundamentalism. And religious fundamentalism is a term that is it's almost like a political term nowadays, and I'm not using it like that. And usually, when people are referred to as a religious fundamentalist, people don't go, "Oh yeah, that's me." Yeah, proud car carrying member right here. It's usually not something that people are proud of. It's usually something that's used as kind of like an insult, and that's not the way I'm using the term. A religious fundamentalist is simply someone who takes a religious text and interprets it literally. So, for example, if you look at the Christian Bible and look at Genesis 1:1, which details how God created the universe, then your perspective is that that is how it actually happened. It's not a metaphor, it's not using symbolic language. That is what actually happened. And there should be no deviation from that text. Uh, and believe it or not, all religions have a tendency of becoming fundamentalist at a certain point. There's not really a religion that I'm aware of that hasn't had a fundamentalist, sort of period or sect. But what's kind of striking is that if you think about some of the things that religions might want to be fundamentalist about or strict about. Like, for example, the creation of the universe or the origin of humanity. What's kind of fascinating is that most Christian churches during the 1800s had basically reconciled themselves with Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, of course, some had sort of reconciled more than others, but for example, the Catholic Church sort of formally embraced evolution, didn't really see that there was any contradiction between evolution by natural selection and, the tenets of the older New Testaments. And, most of the major sort of Protestant denominations had, maybe grudgingly, but had accepted the theory of evolution. But you see this pushback in the 1920s. And of course, the example that most people bring up is the Scopes Monkey trial, in which it's a trial that involves the Tennessee legislature outlawing the teaching of evolution in schools. And there was a question as to whether or not that was actually legal. And apparently, Clarence Darrow, a prominent defense attorney, and a retired William Jennings Bryan decide to test the legality and constitutionality of this law by encouraging a local science teacher to basically teach evolution. He is reported to the authorities, spends a night in prison, or I think maybe even less than that, and then is promptly bailed out. And apparently that is enough to use this as a test case. And so the Scopes Monkey trial is one of those trials that kind of highlights the divisions between religious fundamentalists and many of their detractors that live in big cities. The trial itself is used as a vehicle not only to test the legality of this law, but also to kind of air out different theological views between modernists who basically believed that evolution and Christianity were compatible, and fundamentalists who believed that they were not. John T. Scopes, the science teacher who turns himself in for teaching the theory of evolution, is found guilty during the trial, but eventually the verdict is overturned due to a technicality. But again, the trial itself just sort of underlines the fact that there is this gulf between basically religious fundamentalists and their modernist counterparts. And one of the reasons why we do see the emergence of fundamentalism is that, religions are, throughout world history, great stabilizing influences. And one of the things that we kind of see during this time period is that everything has kind of changed. And the more things change, like if you sort of adopt this karmic or philosophical outlook towards history, then the more there's that urge for things to stay the same. And so if you want things to really stay the same, you might interpret religious texts literally. Let me wrap up today with what is probably an incredibly simplistic explanation for the emergence of religious fundamentalism, which is that maybe during a time period in which Americans find themselves increasingly at odds with one another over everything, maybe fundamentalism is simply a desire to believe in something and believe it fervently. Because what we kind of see is that Americans feel or have a sense of disillusionment in so many things. Americans are becoming suspicious of immigrants. Americans are having religious disputes. And of course, we see a lot of social and political conflicts in the 1920s that are not really that obvious to us, I think. And so by the end of the 1920s, most Americans believed that our involvement in World War I was a mistake. And by the end of the decade, we have this moment in 1927 where Charles Lindbergh boards his aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis, and makes the first transatlantic flight from New York City to Paris. For this action, Charles Lindbergh is heralded by the press and by millions of Americans as the greatest hero in human history. And admittedly, jumping in this jalopy and flying across the Atlantic Ocean did take some heroics and daring do. And you can't take that away from the guy. However, maybe the reason that he is embraced as a hero is because Americans find that, at least for a moment in time, they can put aside their differences and all believe in something. Fast forward almost a half century, at least a generation, to the year 1969, and Americans do the same thing during the midst of the Vietnam War as the first astronauts walk on the moon. Those moments are transcendent. But maybe the reason they're transcendent is not just because it shows what we're capable of with willpower and brain power combined, but because it's at a point where we need to believe in something because we don't believe in much else. And on that really depressing, almost nihilistic note, that is where we will end. And by the way, things are about to get more depressing as we continue in our journey towards the Great Depression. Gave you a lot to look forward to. Thanks, guys.